My foster brother Norman insisted that my video games were re-traumatizing him, and somehow my parents agreed. Norman had spent his first 13 years in one of the roughest houses in the city, but for years, he'd worn that history almost like a badge of resilience, proud that none of it seemed to affect him. That pride evaporated the exact moment he found out my Christmas gift cost $14 more than his. Suddenly he was fragile, wounded, haunted by repressed memories anytime another kid nearby got something nice. When my 10-year-old cousin got lead string light for her birthday, he snapped her remote in half because his own childhood had no light. He told our aunt to stop buying her own children Christmas presents and demanded my parents start giving him surprise gifts every month to compensate for everything he'd missed. Then I bought myself a PS5 with my own money, and according to Norman, that was emotional violence too. I offered to let him play, even offered to buy him his own custom controller. He refused everything except demanding I only play when he wasn't in the living room. Headphones weren't enough. Within a week, the console had been relocated to my bedroom, capped at a low frame rate so the light wouldn't bother him passing by. That lasted 2 days before I came home to find him curled up on the bathroom floor in my mother's arms, sobbing that glimpsing my PS5 menu through a cracked door had wrecked him. My mother looked at me like I was the villain. New rules followed immediately. 1 hour max after 9 p.m., minimum brightness so no light could escape under my door. When I objected, my dad told me games weren't worth destroying his recovery. I tried to comply completely for weeks, but Norman began documenting every perceived violation, photos of light under my door, recordings of controller clicks from the hallway, until my parents gave me an ultimatum. Give the console away or move it to the basement. I chose the basement. No heat, spiders dropping from the ceiling, a dying TV with maybe 3 working pixels, but at least I could turn the volume up. That held until Norman failed a midterm, the result of skipping class to smoke with older kids, and somehow that too became my fault. He claimed he'd heard the console through the floor during study time and chosen not to say any, sacrificing himself so I could enjoy what he never had. My parents treated him like a martyr and moved the PS5 into our unused garage, full of 40-year-old paint cans and insects nobody could identify. That's where I spent my weekends, gaming banned entirely on weekdays. 3 months of silence followed, until Norman needed something from the garage himself, walked in, and immediately collapsed with full body tremors at the sight of the console. That was the final straw for my parents. Sell the PS5 entirely. Norman, still performing sainthood, suggested I could just play mobile games. That's what poor kids did. My mother started browsing used PS5 listings on eBay while I finally snapped. I set up a camera, I said. After my controller went missing a month ago, I connected my phone to the living room TV. Every Sunday during church, Norman had been charging neighborhood kids $10 an hour to play my console footage clear as day, along with screenshots of his own tech bragging that his foster parents believed anything if I cried. The room went dead silent. My parents' faces cycled through disbelief, while Norman scrambled through his usual arsenal of expressions, landing on wounded innocence, insisting he was creating a safe space for kids whose families couldn't afford gaming systems. My mother, predictably, softened immediately. While they debated his supposed charity work, I quietly unplugged my PS5 and changed every password in front of me. My mother declared, in her best teacher voice, that nobody would be playing anything until we sorted this out as a family. That night, I backed every piece of evidence up across 3 cloud services and emailed copies to my dad's inbox labeled evidence, do not delete. Norman knocked later with his fake gentle voice, insisting he'd only been monitoring the kids to keep them on age-appropriate games and planned to donate the money to charity. I didn't buy it. At dinner, my mother somehow made the entire conversation about my violation of Norman's privacy for setting up the camera in the first place. Privacy is sacred, she said, passing the potatoes, completely ignoring the photos and recordings Norman had been taking of me for weeks. The next morning, Norman had already posted online about being ambushed and betrayed by an unsupportive family, racking up sympathetic comments before I'd even gotten to school, where whispers had already spread through the hallways. By second period, I was called to see the school counselor, Dana, who listened to the entire saga without interrupting, then told me plainly I'd done nothing wrong protecting my own property. She helped me build an actual plan, document everything, set firm boundaries, don't engage with provocation, back up evidence across multiple platforms, and for the first time in days, I felt like I had some control. That evening, my dad quietly moved the PS5 into my room for good. No common area. It wasn't an apology, but it meant something. Norman, naturally, staged another performance of reconciliation that night, loud enough for our parents to hear when I declined it, framing himself as the one reaching out and me as the one refusing to forgive. 3 days of silence later, a neighbor showed up demanding a refund. Her sons had paid Norman $40 total to play my console. My mother went white as the truth became undeniable outside our own wall. My dad pulled up our home security footage and found unmistakable evidence. Kids entering our garage every Sunday, exactly matching our church schedule. Even my mother couldn't argue with the timestamp. The family meeting that followed, my dad insisted Norman repay the money and that we establish real boundaries around the console. My mother, instead, pivoted immediately to the ethics of me recording Norman without permission. I bought a small lockbox for my controllers and cables that night, giving only my dad the combination. Norman texted me a long message that evening accusing me of destroying the family and demanding I delete the footage. I didn't respond, just screenshotted it for the file. At church that Sunday, another parishioner mentioned to my mother that she'd seen kids going in and out of our garage the previous week. My mother's humiliation was now fully public. Days later, Norman's caseworker, Elise, arrived for a scheduled check-in. My dad, for once, brought up the entire garage scheme unprompted. Elise documented everything methodically, drew up a behavioral contract requiring Norman to repay each family and stop taking money from minors, and had him sign it. My mother barely glanced at her own copy before folding it away. Norman immediately started claiming he had no money to repay anyone, deflecting every suggestion, even a part-time job, as something that would interfere with his trauma recovery. I eventually moved the PS5 entirely to my friend Eden's house, where her family had a finished basement and no interest in any of this drama. For the first time in months, I could game without bracing for the next meltdown. When I got home that evening, Norman noticed the console gone and accused me of hiding family property, insisting I was denying him the chance to make amends by sharing something that had never been his to share. My mother, predictably, looked concerned about me rather than him. The next day, I came home to find my lockbox emptied onto my bed. My mother had searched my room looking for the missing console, then confronted me in the kitchen about hiding things from the family, seemingly untroubled by the fact she'd gone through my belongings uninvited. That same night, my dad finally got a call back from the neighbor, confirming the exact dollar amount Norman had collected. Bank records backed it up. Norman's story shifted every single time new evidence surfaced. My mother kept trying to steer every conversation back toward healing instead of punishment, while my dad grew visibly more exhausted trying to hold a boundary that kept dissolving under her. At school, Dana helped me rehearse simple, repeatable boundaries boundary statements to use whenever Norman tried to re-engage me about the console. It worked mostly, until my gaming headset disappeared entirely, with no proof of what happened to it, just Norman's hollow "maybe I lost it" shrug at dinner. My dad eventually implemented a strict schedule, keeping Norman and me on separate routines entirely, different meals, different TV hours, essentially cohabitating strangers. My mother resisted, worried about our brotherhood, but eventually gave in. Then came Elise's next visit, spreading behavior logs and repayment plans across our dining table, warning that continued problems could mean Norman's placement would change. My mother's hands shook signing the paperwork. That weekend, Norman came home at 3 a.m. reeking of weed. My dad wanted a drug test immediately. My mother, in tears, argued that testing him now would be kicking him while he's down. Days later, the neighbor called again, threatening small claims court if she wasn't repaid by Friday. My dad ultimately wrote an $800 check from our family's vacation savings to cover it all, promising Norman would work it off, a promise everyone in the room understood would never actually happen. Norman escalated by calling our aunt in tears, painting himself as persecuted. She called my mother screaming about traumatizing a foster child. My mother spent an hour placating her while quietly defending Norman regardless of the fact. Later that night, she asked if I'd apologize to Norman over the camera. I refused. For once, she didn't push. Eden's family eventually offered to keep the console safely stashed for me long-term, clearing a permanent spot in their basement. It wasn't home, but it was Keith. The new separation schedule actually seemed to be working. Norman and I barely crossed paths, and the house, while quieter, felt less like a battlefield. That fragile calm broke the day I found my old PS4 controller smashed to pieces in the basement. Norman, barely looking up from the TV, claimed he'd stepped on it in the dark, the small smirk on his face saying otherwise. I photographed the wreckage without comment. When my dad saw the photos later, he actually got angry at Norman for once, giving him a choice: pay $40 for a replacement or work it off in chores. Norman argued for an hour about the unfairness of accidents before storming off and slamming his door hard enough to knock a picture off the wall. That night, a crash from downstairs turned out to be Norman punching a hole clean through the hallway drywall, then collapsing into a fake crying heap while my mother rubbed his back and my dad stood by, visibly defeated. Elise, informed of the incident, mandated twice weekly anger management sessions starting immediately. Norman declared the therapist an idiot after session 1. By session 2, the therapist himself had already flagged concerns about his resistance to treatment. At church that Sunday, another parishioner quietly told my dad she'd seen Norman behind the grocery store smoking with known troublemakers. Confirmation the problem went far beyond gaming. New house rules followed, strictly for Norman. No phone after 8 p.m., no unapproved outings, no unsupervised friends, daily room check. He called it discrimination. My mother started finding beer cans and cigarette pack during those checks and quietly disposing of them without comment. Meanwhile, Eden's family grew uneasy about liability keeping my console at their house long-term and gave me 2 weeks to find another solution. Exhausted, I seriously considered just selling it to end the constant war. My dad found me looking at resale listings, sat with me in silence, then told me he'd support whatever I decided, that sometimes peace mattered more than being right. Something about that made me decide to keep fighting instead of surrendering. The following weekend, my dad asked me to skip gaming entirely to let tensions cool. I agreed, watching Norman smirk from the hallway like he'd won. The next morning, I found him tearing through the garage searching for a console he was convinced I'd hidden there, making a disaster of the space in the process. Failing to find anything, he told Elise during her next visit that I must have secretly sold the PS5 and pocketed the money. She asked for any proof. He had none. When Elise returned for a follow-up, I laid out everything. Text with Eden arranging the console's temporary relocation, photos of it safely set up in her room, months of bank statements showing no unusual deposit. Elise noted, in writing, an emerging pattern of false accusations against me. Norman exploded, accused everyone of always believing lies about him, and fled to his room in a performative panic that even Elise, typing calmly into her tablet, didn't fall for this time. The following week, my dad scheduled family therapy over my mother's reluctant agreement, prompted by Elise's repeated warning. Norman, predictably, later Googled things like how to manipulate therapists and what to say in family therapy to win, a search history I happened to screenshot when he left his phone unlocked on the counter. The therapist, unfazed by his usual deflections, assigned concrete homework, separate living spaces, documented restitution progress, no contact with any neighborhood kids under 16. My mother signed the agreement looking devastated. Norman signed with theatrical reluctance. Within 3 days, he'd already violated the no-contact rule, texting the same brothers he'd exploited before. My dad, for once holding firm despite my mother's protest, confiscated his phone for a full week, citing Elise's warning about possible removal from our home. Norman went cold and silent, somehow more unsettling than his usual dramatic, before posting online again about his abusive household. This time, kids from school who actually knew the truth flooded the comments, exposing the real story. He deleted the post within the hour, but screenshots were already circulating. He attempted one more apology in my room shortly after, claiming he understood he'd been difficult. I thanked him but kept my distance, unable to tell if it was sincere or just another angle. That weekend, I brought the PS5 to Eden's for an uninterrupted game night with friends. No volume limit, no time restrictions, no meltdown looming. I realized, somewhat peacefully, that keeping my gaming life entirely separate from home might just be the permanent solution, and I was surprisingly okay with that. At her next monthly review, Elise noted only partial compliance from Norman, warning again that continued issues could mean a different placement altogether. My parents finally seemed to understand this had never really been about video games. It was a pattern of manipulation stretching far beyond any single console. Norman kept testing boundaries quietly now, more careful about which lies might actually cost him something real. The weeks that followed were tense but calmer. Norman stopped his big dramatic scenes, but I'd regularly catch him watching me from doorways when he thought I wasn't looking. My parents relocated the PS5 to my dad's office, letting me play only Saturday mornings before his shift started, meaning I'd wake at 5 a.m. and bike 4 miles in the dark for 2 uninterrupted hours before surrendering the desk back to him. Norman, meanwhile, spent his nights on hushed phone calls about new opportunity, while my parents visibly aged under the accumulated stress. My dad started locking his home off. My mother put a padlock on the garage after Norman tried selling our old lawnmower to a stranger off Craigslist. I got a part-time job bagging groceries, 20 hours a week, and quietly opened a savings account my parents didn't know about legal at 17, without a parent signature. Every shift, I calculated how many more hours stood between me and first month rent on a place of my own. Norman tried following me to work once and got kicked out by my manager for harassing customers about foster kid donations. After that, I varied my routes home and kept my schedule as invisible as possible, unwilling to let him track anything else that was mine. Looking back, the video games were never really the issue. They were just the first thing convenient enough to weaponize, a stand-in for a much older, much deeper resentment that had nothing to do do with a console and everything to do with a kid who'd learned, long before he ever met our family, that tears were the fastest currency in any room. I don't know if Norman will ever stop testing that theory on someone. I just know I finally stopped being the only person willing to let him. The months after that settled into something I can only describe as an uneasy truth. Norman's caseworker kept coming for her scheduled visit, each time nodding incremental, grudging compliance mixed with fresh evidence of boundary testing that never quite crossed the line into another full-blown crisis. He'd stopped smashing things and posting online, but he developed a quieter kind of pettiness instead, leaving my bike tires slightly deflated. Accidentally, using the last of the milk before I got up for a shift, small enough grievances that documenting each one felt exhausting and faintly ridiculous, even though I still wrote every one of them down out of habit. My parents changed in ways I hadn't expected. My dad became someone who actually followed through on consequences instead of just threatening them, which felt strange after years of watching him back down the second Norman's voice started to shake. My mother's transformation was slower and much less complete. She still occasionally slipped into old patterns, still occasionally suggested we just try being kinder to Norman when a new issue surfaced, but she stopped actively rewriting reality in front of me, which I'd come to realize was the most I could reasonably hope for. Eden's family became something like a second home in the specific, practical sense that mattered most, a place my belongings were safe and my hobbies didn't require a legal defense. I started spending more time there generally, not just for gaming, and her parents never made me feel like an inconvenience for needing somewhere calm to exist. I think about how easily that arrangement could have fallen apart too. How much of my stability during that stretch depended on the kindness of people who had absolutely no obligation to provide it. The job at the grocery store turned into something more than just a way to hide money from Norman. I liked the rhythm of it, the straightforward exchange of effort for pay, the total absence of manipulation in bagging someone's groceries correctly. My manager, the same one who'd kicked Norman out for harassing customers, started giving me extra shift once he learned a little about what was happening at home, never asking for details, just quietly making sure I always had somewhere to be that wasn't there. By the time I turned 18, I had enough saved for a security deposit and first month's rent on a studio apartment 15 minutes from my parents' house, modest, a little rundown, entirely mine. Moving out felt less like abandoning my family and more like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. I brought the PS5 there first, before I brought almost anything else, and set it up in the corner of my new living room with something like ceremony. Nobody was going to time how long I played it. Nobody was going to accuse it of re-traumatizing them. It just sat there, plugged in, mine, boring in the best possible way. Norman and I still see each other occasionally at family gatherings, technically civil, carefully distant. He's had 2 more disrupted placements since I moved out, according to things I've overheard rather than anything anyone tells me directly. Part of me still can't fully separate genuine pity for whatever happened to him before he ever walked through our front door from the exhaustion of everything he did once he got there. Both things are true at once, and I've stopped trying to resolve that contradiction into something simpler than it actually is. What I carry forward from all of it isn't really about gaming consoles or garages full of spiders or lockboxes with combinations only my father knew. It's the slow, specific realization that being the reasonable one in a room doesn't automatically protect you. That adults will absolutely let a child manipulate an entire household if the alternative feels harder than giving in. I learned to document everything not because I distrusted my own memory, but because I learned early that memory alone wasn't going to be enough to make anyone believe me. That's a strange lesson to carry out of your teenage years, but it served me well since, in ways that have nothing to do with video games at all. Sometimes I still wake up early out of habit, even with nobody left to compete with for the television or the bandwidth or the last lean controller. I make coffee, sit down in my own quiet apartment, and play for exactly as long as I want to, with nobody keeping score. Occasionally friends ask why I don't seem angrier about the whole thing, especially the parts involving my mother, who I think never fully reconciled the version of Norman she wanted to believe in with the version that kept showing up in bank statements and security footage. I've thought about that question a lot, and the honest answer is that anger stopped feeling useful somewhere around the 5th or 6th time I had to document another misunderstanding. What replaced it wasn't peace exactly, more like a kind of clear-eyed distance, an understanding that some people will always choose the version of events that cost them the least emotionally, regardless of what the evidence says, and that no amount of screenshots or camera footage was ever going to change that particular math for her. I've also had time to think about what it must have actually been like for Norman, underneath all the performance, though I try not to let that thinking slide into accusing anything. 13 years in circumstances none of us in that house could fully imagine, then dropped into a family that had, by comparison, an almost embarrassing amount of stability and things to spare. I can see, faintly, how that contrast might curdle into something ugly in a kid who'd never had anyone teach him what to do with grief that big. Understanding the roots of something doesn't obligate you to keep absorbing the consequences of it, though. And that's the balance I had to find for myself, mostly alone, mostly through trial and error, and a lot of late night talking things through with Dana, and later, with Eden's family, who never once made me feel like a burden for needing somewhere safe to land. If there's a version of this story I'd tell a younger kid going through something similar, it wouldn't be about consoles or garages or lockboxes at all. It would be simpler than that. Keep records, even when it feels paranoid or excessive, because the people who are supposed to protect you won't always do it, and sometimes the only leverage you'll ever have is proof. Find the adults outside your house who will actually listen without an agenda, and know that it's allowed to protect something that's yours, fully, without apologizing for the fact that protecting it inconveniences someone else's narrative about themselves. That's most of what I took out of those 2 years, in the end. Not resentment, exactly, though there's still some of that left over on the harder days. Mostly just a very specific, very hard one kind of self-trust, the sense that I could see what was actually happening in front of me, hold on to that clearly even when everyone around me insisted on a different story, and eventually build a life quiet enough that none of it mattered anymore.